Svinblad, who is the Policy Director and Head of Practice, Environment, Climate and Biodiversity for the USCIB, the US Council for International Business, and as I can attest to, an international expert in global environmental policy that focuses in particular on climate change as well as biodiversity and plastic pollution. And then next, I'm going to have you introduce yourself because we have a step-in, so do you mind?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jayant Chaudhary. I work for an organization called Alliance for an Energy Efficient Economy. I lead the industry engagement there. So we are a research think tank working more towards implementation. So we work with a lot of state governments and capacity building programs around sustainable funding, decarbonization.
لا تمام عادي تسألني.
Thanks so much, Anthony. This we are not you. So Felicity Schwartz is Director of Sustainable Business Model Structure at EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Another expert in sustainable finance policy and impact investment. And then last but not least, we have Dana Busby, who is the Global Head of Sustainability Strategy and Net Zero at Standard Chartered Bank. So we have private finance, we have development finance, we have industry, we have industry association, not but specific energy and India. And we have also business and industry focus, the US. So I think we've got the whole gamut of blended finance covered. So let's get into the questions. So we have a series of questions, and I'm just going to ask each of you to comment, give me an indication and comment, and I'll pop to you together. The first general question is how can blended finance structures be designed to effectively de-risk climate investments? And then I'd like you to start with this because I think it's important that we just clarify for anyone new to the area or not new but perhaps not understanding as much as they might understand. What is blended finance from a bank's perspective?
So blended finance, I think, to your point, is when you bring in parts such as entities, governments, even philanthropic organizations to de-risk private capital. And that can take many forms. I think the most understood would be a guarantee, where it's a default and a guarantee will come back. There's many other forms as well. So for instance, there's concessional equity or types of capital structures so that effectively you are able to modify the risk and the return. And we see a growing number of blended finance products emerge from fund structures to debt for sustainability swaps, brings in guarantor. Actually, I see a bunch of MVPs next door, and so many of them have contributed to debt for sustainability swaps. And all of those together form blended finance. And the one thing I think is really important in this conversation, and it's really resonating out through the top, which is historically, we've thought about blended finance, I think when we started at the project level, and we've done, at Standard Chartered, we've done a tremendous number of project finance, blended finance projects, and that moved on to fund structures. And there's been a lot of really interesting fund structures emerging. But I think what's really noticeable out right now is the emergence of the country platform, which is now thinking about blended finance in a holistic way. What's the priority for the country? How do we structure it, bring in the right players at the right time? And I think that's really, I think, an exciting thing to hear how many country platforms are emerging from the top.
And while we've got you, just on exactly that, how important do you think is the private banking resource in emerging markets and even in frontier markets, pension
ones that are critical, and we're trying to change that equation. I mean, we have participated in some of the early government-led country platforms, and that's wonderful. But we are also trying to shift that paradigm. So it's not just governments working alone, but working and bringing in the private sector super early. I mean, we announced a country platform, the country of Lesotho, which is a small landlocked country inside of South Africa. And historically, the country has had challenges, like the brightest people would have to go overseas for jobs. They were an energy importer. And now, we use the country platforms and bring in MPDs, and bring in industry associations, and bring in philanthropy, and bring in insurance companies, and all coming in together really early to figure out which projects are going to be able to be financed, that we are hoping will be able to change the country to a clean energy exporter into the South African grid, and that also creates jobs. And so that's just the shift, that the power of the shift of the country platform will be really tremendous.
So blended finance to de-risk private finance for all. Everybody's finance. Yeah, that's the thing. You said bringing in MDBs. So let's bring in MDBs with Felicity. And Felicity, what I'm sorry, I've already gone off script, but I'm enjoying it all so much. Felicity, the MDBs have been around for a long time. It's obviously not the oldest, but it's been around for some decades. And it will be almost a developmental board at a different time and have a different approach to development finance. I would be really interested to hear, I'm sorry to throw this at you, but I'd be interested to hear how the evolution of not the history of development banks, but the approach as the private sector is moving more towards financing this meeting the Paris Agreement.
Role of development banks as well. And I often think of it as mobilization, provision and mobilization as a rock and ripples. So the provision being the rock in the pot in the pool, and the ripples being the mobilization. So you are the rock. But how has that changed, if at all, in the last, since Paris?
I think what we see, and particularly this year, we see strong headwinds against sort of donors providing for climate. And I think we also see a reduction because of energy security, food security, and the multiplication of issues facing governments, a decrease in grants, so donor finance. So I'd like to distinguish when we look at blended finance, the donor component, the grant component, for what maybe MDBs like the EBRD, which has a mandate to support the private sector, to support economies thrive, because we believe you need a thriving economy making money, which is green, to be sustainable. And so our mandate is very much focused on private sector. So we invest, in general, we invest about 60% in the private sector. We include sovereign, so state-owned utilities are in that. But we are, unlike other MDBs, we rarely fund to sovereigns, but we do provide sovereign guarantees. So for us, I think the evolution of blended finance has moved from providing a guarantee or a concession or loan to looking very much at how we drive a holistic approach. So I think the move has gone from what is blended finance from funds and how do we bring it together, and that was about 15 years ago, to today in this context, which I just outlined, to an approach on how do we maximize the grant with concessional instruments at scale, and how do we define this portfolio so that the blended finance drives a sustainable vehicle that can live without the blending. So it's a catalytic, it's considered to be more of a catalytic approach, and then the question is how do you structure right? And so what we've been doing at the EBRD is we really do see that for every €1 of like European aid, we invest about €3 of our own investment, which enables private sector investment of about €5. So you get a 1 to 8 for the donor, which is attractive, and of course through our blending, you provide them with that €3. The private sector money goes further; they achieve more, and all of that on the back of a AAA rated MDB, which has of course security through our technical competence, and can actually drive confidence in markets or in new areas where we need to go. I'll stop there, but obviously I can go into the details of innovative mechanisms, but I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, no, don't stop, because I just want to underscore something which I think is really important and often overlooked, I think, is that when I, my metaphor of rock and ripples, when there's less rock, because there's less money with security and things, people spending money on different things, grantors are spending money on different things, you can still make your rock more powerful by wrapping it up in different kinds of de-risking legal instruments. And that's what you're talking about with the sovereign guarantees. You don't pay with a sovereign guarantee. You just come in if the project defaults. And if it's a good de-risk project, it shouldn't default, right?
Exactly, and I think what's really interesting is how in this climate, MDBs are really pulling together. We do collaborate and have always been, but I think we're all very aware of the need to reach scale, and so country platforms is one. But we're also, trialing out sort of different mechanisms like synthetic risk transfers, right? Where we use our, the availability of like the risk on a loan to actually give the secondary tranche more money to invest in the underlying assets. This builds confidence as people invest in green in countries they haven't invested in, and then we can remove that sort of blended support mechanism when the market understands it. And the other thing is syndication, clubbing together around a country platform. Supply value chain is another, supply value chain finance we're very interested in, and on lending. We do a lot of on lending to build capacity in country banks. So, rather than us lend to multiple SMEs, we can provide a large concessional loan and require that the local banks actually start applying green or climate criteria to their investments. So you're training up the financial system. And these are all components of the blending, in a way. It's not only how you blend, it's who you're working with. And I think we're working on the who you're working with bit. So the rocks are working out where the pebbles are, or I don't know how to,
You know what I hear when I hear you speaking, Felicity, is I hear in action climate justice and just transition.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. Okay, Jayanti. Okay, so is it working on the ground? Is this happening? What's? Give us a just an untainted view of how is this following through? Because there's a lot of criticism on this provision of climate finance that it isn't reaching where it needs to be reaching. So talk us through what you're seeing on that.
Thank you. I think in India, it's as you rightly said, it's been a mixed bag, but we definitely have some green shoots, some great examples how it works. But I don't think it's still reached a level where it's completely, say, policy aligned, at scale and really, working on ground for various different reasons. So what we clearly see is one is like the guarantees and risk sharing. To me, probably, and the way we work. Is I think one of the number one areas where it seems to be working. So we work on with ESCOs. We are primarily a research think tank, but also industry-led. So ESCO has been something very critical. And I think one of the biggest challenges in India is that it seems too risky. There are a lot of startups who do that, and there is just nobody who's willing to finance, primarily because there's also a lack of a very robust performance management contracts, M&V that goes back behind it. So SIDBI, which is a small industry development bank of India, they tied up with CTF and with Jeff, and they launched something called a partial risk guarantee scheme, and that really worked well. So they have roughly about 81 projects that they kind of did the risk thing. They managed to leverage the entire portfolio, SIDBI, at about 40x, 46x if I'm not mistaken. So they now have a $2 billion portfolio. There was literally no defaults in any of these, but that actually led to a push of a major ESCO project. But yes, is it at scale? Sadly, no. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. Second area where it's actually worked in India has been concessional capital. Of course, the cost of debt is very high, and the access, and again, that's not only for say ESCO projects, but many others. So there's been a couple of success stories in India, like the Green Growth Equity Fund, which again there was a sovereign involvement of the government of UK, India, and I think it got crowdsourced of 1.3x. They managed to kind of get the private finance, and they invested in three major areas which are very critical from a national priority perspective. So it is solar, it is EVs, and it is waste management. And they invested in multiple organizations, but three major success stories of that, I think it was Ayana Capital, Green Cell Mobility, and Ever Revivo. I mean, they are really success stories of how this kind of an arrangement can work, from a pure concessional funding. Uh, Probably another one which is a mixed example is the Reva solar power project, where that time the cost of solar and the auction was very high. You're again it was CTF, IFC actually did they worked very hard to make these projects bankable. CTF came with some concessional funding, and they got some 575 million investment from one of the Indian large organization, Mahindra, and it was for kind of a ultra 750 megawatts solar power plant, and it was a success story. And the best part of this is this particular arrangement of the risk sharing, concessional financing, and everything. The rates that came in was about 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which was the lowest ever, and it was lower than the cost of fossil fuel the way the electricity was produced. So these are, I think, some examples that have actually worked very well, driving the push. But yes, I think is there enough? I think somebody told me, there's enough money, but there's not enough risk-taking appetite by especially the Indian banks, the local banks there, to invest in a lot of these projects, invest in startups. That's what's creating a little bit of a hiccup in actually pushing a lot of these projects.
It's interesting you say there's enough money, and I'm hearing that in every room. And I think people, not all stakeholders in this understand that when we talk about moving capital, it's not you spend it once. It's not like money in your purse. You spend it, it's gone. It's almost like the first rule of thermodynamics with energy. You just keep it moving round. And so for your project, if you can free up the capital with a partial guarantee, as you said, on one project, that then releases that money for the next project, and that keeps it moving. Yeah. So I have a question for you, which might not be a very nice question, but I find myself wondering, India and tech didn't need concessional finance. It didn't need a push. It didn't need.
Yeah.
So what magic did that have that's missing here? And is there a learning there?
So I think it's primarily to interest, and have bankable programs, wherein the tech sector and others, they feel they want to get involved. But I think to your point, I think that we see a lot of startups, especially in the clean tech system and others, who are really struggling with the finance in the program. So there was a classic example of a small organization like called Simpa. I mean, they were doing rooftop solar, but a very small scale, but nobody wanted to finance them. They had the technology. So in many cases that we see, technology is available, but it's just that finance is not available because either the organization is small or they find it very risk. So there was, I think, CTF that kind of invested about $6 million, to them. They use that money to do about 75,000 more homes that they do. They were doing solarization of rural areas. It just worked brilliantly, and the impact of that was this particular small organization got bought out by NG after this particular project was over. So that's a classic example. So it's question of how do we push them in and get them involved in this project. So there are a couple of large national projects that we are kind of involved with today. So people who have worked in India might be knowing the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, PMAY. So that's kind of the world's largest affordable housing program. So it's like $100 billion being given by the sovereign. almost 2x coming in from the people who are doing that. So it's about roughly 200 or $2,000 being given to people to build their own houses. But the reality is people are just building it the way it is. So where we are coming in and we are saying is that, look, these buildings are going to be there for the next 20, 30 years. They need to be built with resilience, thermal comfort, which is the biggest challenge in India. Where is the technology? How can the industry get involved? And to your point, so we're saying that, okay, can we have a templatized and don't work on a project level? And that's one of the things we're saying, work at a program level, because that's where there is enough money, enough scale to happen. So we said, have, companies provide a kind of a ready-made templates that can be used, can build these resilient houses, thermal comfort for all. And yeah, I think while the sovereign is giving, say, the major fund, there could be funding that could come in from, say, MDBs and others, so to make these buildings resilient along with the industry. And then we are saying that, okay, can the industry also get involved in either giving a concessional rate or some interest subvention for some of the energy efficient appliances? So we work very closely on the appliances part, and let's say rather than a fan, give them a BLDC fan. But there is a difference of almost a $15 there. Can that be subsidized? That's where we feel the industry can come in. More kind of appliances and others to make the life better. So
I'm really pleased you gave us an example of building resilience, because the Brazilian presidency and the Brazilians talk about the adaptation economy. And there's been a bit of a trope in these negotiations over the years that private finance can't fund adaptation. That must be funded by aid. And as I'm hearing from the presidency is, well, that's nonsense. I mean, the whole, we don't finance green, we green finance, and we need everything to meet the climate objectives, which include mitigation, adaptation, resilience building. Agnes, last but not least, love to bring you in here because the US is a huge consumer, but also a huge net exporter of capital in private investment, both equity, debt, directly through financial institutions, but also through corporations. So I guess the original question, blended finance structures from a private sector sort of US investor perspective. Love to hear sort of how that threads into what we've heard so far.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm really thrilled to be here. And it's funny, I've heard a lot, of course, of the key points mentioned from every panelist thus far. Just to look at, first off, blended finance is a critical tool to mobilize private sector action, to actually move private capital. I really loved what we heard from Felicity saying that we should view it as a catalyzer, but not the final solution. That's a key point from a private sector perspective. So really appreciate you emphasizing that. So I would say first, it really demands a mindset shift overall in the conversations. We've heard a lot about wanting, grant-based financial solutions. We're hearing references to concessional finance. So when we look at the role of blended finance, I think it's really important that that is part of that conversation. And especially when I look at the negotiations here, for example, at COP every year, we do hear a lot of references to wanting debt-free, grant-based finance. And that's where I see a need for somewhat of a mindset shift. It's coming, it's happening, we're seeing it in front of our eyes. We're hearing examples from Dana talking about the country platforms, for example. But that mindset shift cannot be overstated, the need for it and the role of all of us in facilitating that mindset shift. Second, early and continuous engagement with the financial sector and with the private sector at large is essential to making the structure of blended finance initiatives workable and actually implementable. Third, again, I feel I'm stealing some points here from what's already been said, but truly the national ownership point. And that is for many reasons, because when we have it brought down to national ownership, allowing national governments to steer it, we can then also customize it to regional, to national needs, which I think is really critical. And then we've also kind of touch upon this as well, but just to say that blended finance is not a universal solution, which also is why it makes it very complex, and it needs to be complex for it to work and for it to be credible, because it needs to be adapted to national circumstances, to regional circumstances. We've also touched upon a little bit, but I think this is an important one to get into even more. What are those transitional steps when we look at blended finance as the catalyzer, but again, not the permanent solution? What does the next steps look like, and how do we facilitate them? Because we view blended finance as the opportunity of building local markets and building that stability that we need to attract private investment on its own. But what comes next, and how do we facilitate that transition? I think that's also questions that, yes, exactly. I feel like I'm almost asking you that. So if Wendy allows me to hand over the mic, I will.
Yes, and I was actually just going to turn to our sort of turning point is what innovations are needed. So Agnes beautifully served up for Felicity, and Dana, and then it'd be good to hear from you as well in terms of what innovations are needed, and if you could also, accessibility obviously is also another big issue, and data and AI, and if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be interested to hear those as well.
So I mean, let's start with the data. I mean, I think a lot of what we do, particularly when we do things at scale, is we align and we try to collaborate so that the data becomes simpler and aligned. So we, the multi-plethora of standards, what's the bottom line across all of them, and then can you define that and build from there? If you can define that bottom baseline, then you can start digitizing. Don't start digitizing before you've got the clarity across multiple things, otherwise you'll have a problem later.
Rubbish in, rubbish out, right?
Exactly. But to the question of the end goal, and this catalyzer effect, I mean, we've mentioned national, but I think there's also subnational, and there's also supply chains. And you mentioned adaptation, right? Which I think is a really interesting one, because every investment gap is an investment opportunity. The problem with adaptation is that it's got a public good nature in some things. So we invest in flood control infrastructure, but the people who benefit are people and governments and generic infrastructure for everybody. So the private sector will pay their part, but they won't pay for all of it. And I think a little bit of a reality check on the public sector nature of adaptation. But of course, there are venture capital adaptation technologies which can drive, attract investment because they're bankable. New technologies are going to fill the gap. And you see great funds like Jayco's Lighthouse. I can't remember, Light Smith or House. Sorry, Jacob. Doing really well in that regard. So we can do adaptation, yes, absolutely. Do we need to do more adaptation? Yes, which is why the EBRD has set itself the target at the project level to increase adaptation by 50% across its projects. We already are Paris aligned. It's a compliance requirement. So what is the end goal? Our end goal is to really do multiple things. When you do blended finance, you're not just thinking about the private sector, you're thinking about the enabling environment. So the end goal has to be to through that blended finance, develop a sort of experience and that sort of track trail record of this is doable and this is how it makes sense. And then you start sending price signals. Now we need policies to not undermine price signals, which unfortunately in many cases they do. But you can use blended finance vehicles. So we're looking at like green city strategies or low carbon pathways where you define the investments to meet the net zero goal. Here's the goal: net zero decarbonization and a resilient economy is the goal by 2030, 2050. We have it outlined. We don't need to change that. But what are the investment pathway that matches the country of operation, country ownership, target sustainable requirements? So that's the goal. And then how do we get there? The little steps. So people want things and the private sector wants things. So that's where you start. So, if you need renewable energy because you import energy, that's a great place to start. So how do you set a price signal that's fair and help the private sector? Auctions and the difference to contracts are great. They set a price signal and they can be subsidized, the setup of it with technical capacity in the government to align the regulatory framework, which enables discussions about storage, grid stability, and then you can talk about what's it for, the urban environment, energy efficiency, water efficiency, etc. So I think when we can't do everything, but you can start somewhere, and you need to start where there's enough demand around the problem. So the little steps are, what are the problems defined by the country that will lead you to your end goal? And I think we are living in a world where there's these kind of programmatic startups. So the country platforms EBRD are working on are looking at the energy water nexus in Uzbekistan, and we're looking at decarbonisation in Turkey, and we're looking at the energy water nexus in Turkey as well. So North Macedonia, we have a JET-P, so a just transition pathway, and it's really driven around the needs as defined by the country, and then brought down to the city, and then brought down to projects, because bankers want projects. But as an MDB, we can hold the portfolio. But I'm really excited about your work, Dana, on holding the portfolio, because that is actually a bit different. So I have to kind of put a light and say thanks to Standard Charter, because I do think you're leading the way in actually having that mindset, which is programmatic. So I'd love to know more,
Yeah,
Wendy.
Yeah, me too. Me too. On the so, but before, just keep it for one tip, because it's the financial intermediary. I just want to ask you about, because the development banks originally were created at a time where we had very centralized energy systems, big power generation, renewables in a lot of countries which have very remote areas. Decentralized energy systems are a much more sensible approach, and mini grids or small regional grids. How do you use EBRD or any development bank big funding kind of tender type structures when you're talking about little $150 solar panels on individual families? So the financial intermediary is something that's hard, but interesting or
Yeah, it's aggregation. So I think in situations like that, we'd want to build up the local financial sector, and that's where on lending becomes key. I mean, over 40% of our financing is on lending, but with these criteria, because the EBRD is this catalyst that shouldn't be there forever, and the local financial system has to grow with the private sector. And the policy has to enable that. And so, again, this is this catalytic point, to your point, like how do we catalyze that? That's what we're trying to do. So we would on-lend and then like give the bank the requirements that they have to do this climate or renewable, which enables them to deliver to the small, medium enterprises, which we unfortunately can't reach due to our credit risk. We lose our guarantee, but we can support others doing that with sovereign guarantees, so we can bring more money than our own investment as well. And that's this partnership thing where we're looking, we can provide capital, and can we bring more money also to on lending? We can bring more in.
And then you could tie in the tech access as well, because if it's a particular type of PV panel, you can approve the tech and say these micro loans can come from this aggregated fund for this approved tech.
And we do have to, we've got a new strategy on green at the EBRD that we'll launch for public consultation very, very soon, before the end of the year. Just waiting on final board approval, in which we are looking to both continue greening, but also increase the quality of greening, which means a deepening. So we're always being pushed to go further, which opens up, I think, the door for these more risky nature-based solutions, adaptation, these new, where we can apply similar tools and then start doing it, and again, keep pushing more out.
Yeah, Dana, the portfolio approach. So you did say something earlier, which you said, historically the focus has been on project finance, but it's important to look beyond that. But I'm interested also in just pressing on that a little bit more, because the project finance is the real economy. It's where the transition is taking place, but it's also where the real property is. And although there's property interests and financial and different asset classes, but it's where the real property is. And I'm really interested in this portfolio approach and how much of it is focused on project finance versus up the capital stack. Question one. Question two, it's like an exam. Question two, is how much of that portfolio extends just beyond renewable, right, mitigation? How much of it goes into water, land use, food production, beyond into the adaptation economy, which minerals, the whole shebang.
Boy, where to start? There's a lot. So just to touch on the project finance. Project finance remains a critical component and of the country platform. What the country platform does, it helps prioritize which projects get built when. And that, and I think something that Agnes mentioned, which is bringing the private sector into that thinking early, into the policy, making sure the environment is investable. That changes a lot, and also you can think about how to bring in the right partners in the right stage. So project finance is still critical. I think to your point on country platforms, historically they have been around energy transition. I mean, we worked on it in Indonesia, coal decommissioning. So they have been energy focused. It's interesting because I have started thinking about them in terms of other priorities, and we definitely believe we need to listen to the priorities of a country and be led by the priorities of the country. Now, food security, that's a tough one sometimes because the natural environment doesn't lend itself all the time to really extreme reconfiguration of food systems in a country. So that's challenging. I'd love to tackle that one day. I'd love to. I think just to touch on some of the other things though, mobilization is key. And I think MDBs really now start thinking about how does their capital mobilize the private sector capital. Because MDBs, I'd give you more, but they don't have enough capital. And so one other thing that I think MDBs have really started thinking about this year, and EBRD as well, and some have done it a year back, but is how do they originate and then distribute their loans so that they can recycle their capital as much as possible. And I think that's going to be a big unlock in the world. And then I'll just to touch on adaptation. I'm really fortunate. I mean, thank you for the compliment of Standard Chartered, but I am really fortunate that our firm has, we think a little bit differently in that we have groups that are completely dedicated to this. So we have a blended finance programs a group that all they do is they focus on, what country platforms can we bring to market? How can we think about different partnerships? Similarly, we have an adaptation and resilience group that's talking to governments about how do they, really start to make adaptation and resilience investable. I mean, that's a multiplying effect. A dollar spent on that unlocks, much saving, 4 to 10 times savings down the road. I also similarly have a carbon finance group that looks at developing carbon markets in some of these countries. I see on the wall there, and unlock carbon finance. And then similarly, nature finance, an entire team dedicated to both analyzing nature risks, but also using as an opportunity to ensure that we're looking at things like water risks for corporates. And then finally, I just launched a new innovation hub focused on circular economy. And so, just really trying to think about, how we tackle the plastics issue and just recycling, and so it's our thematic approach really allows us to experiment and work with different partners to try to solve problems as opposed to just be reactive on projects.
And Dana, correct me if I'm wrong, but Standard Chartered is not a charity, is it?
No. In fact, we think this is good business, and we have committed to do $1 billion of sustainable finance revenue this year. So it's certainly not a charity and not a small business either.
That's so exciting. That's so exciting. Janty, can I come back to you now? Just listening on what you're hearing from and again, I'm interested because you say engaging with countries and finding out what they need and what they want, and a lot of engagement with India in this climate finance space has been about decarbonizing the energy sector. Obviously critically important, and I don't question that at all. But in this sort of, this future-proofing our world that is almost certainly, if it hasn't already, going to overshoot 1.5. Adaptation is survival of economies. How do you think that, you talked about the building resilience a bit. I'm also interested in the land use more broadly and the water, as this sort of grasp for resources is increasing. How is that translating into economic opportunities for India?
Sorry, I mean, we primarily don't work on the land use and others, so we primarily work around the energy side. But I think what I can say is that, as you rightly said, that there's a lot of investment that's coming probably on the supply side. But what we see is, if you really talk about decarbonization of any of the sectors, overall, even the energy efficiency plays a very critical role, and it's not sexy enough, it does not get financed. So that's I think, one of the big challenges we keep facing, and whether the example I gave about, say,
We all
I
think
wish you
it's
could see this on
sexy.
the, I wish you could see this on the ground, but as it just it's a struggle to get kind of funding and finances for that. And again, say the example that I gave about, say, the PMAY. $300 billion, some 40 million homes have, I think, already been built, more coming up. They are not being built energy efficient. So, when we are talking about, future proofing and how do you provide thermal comfort and bring in the overall larger angle. So, a couple of things, I mean, we find, again, correct me, if I'm wrong, again, I'm not an expert in this field, but MDBs, I think the focus on MRV sometimes is very complicated. And for, at a grassroots level, when we are trying to do, even at a programmatic level, we do believe, can this be made a little more simpler so that, some projects like, say, this PMAY, or let's say the example I was giving, let's say the concessional tranche kind of supports making them resilient, making, say, thermal comfort, disaster resilient, and others, which is not happening today. Let's say, can there be some kind of a commercial tranche that comes in with, say, super energy efficient appliances to make them? And let's say the metrics that can be used, that even, say, we use in any of our programs and others, very simple. What is the indoor temperature compared to, say, this particular house compared to the others? How much is the savings per kilowatt hour? And probably on, indoor temperature. Now, on similar lines, when you multiply this by the millions of houses, we do believe it makes a very strong case for kind of funding. I don't know, I said, I would love to hear from you. But no, so absolutely. So we primarily provide all the sensors, we are tracking this. We did a very small project in a pack house, but it's not that, as you rightly said, it got funded by a philanthropy. We just made it, but if you just leave it active, it just becomes a white elephant. Now there's a 95% shortage there. But what we are tracking as an organization is what crop comes in, whole year, what is the impact, what is the improvement in the livelihood of the farmers, what kind of energy efficiency is there as it's off-grid. We are tracking all this in a fairly robust MRV, but since we do MNV, as a part of our ESCO work under the IPMVP protocol, we do believe, can this be simplified, use something, and these metrics, can they drive some of these projects? We do believe that there can be a huge impact. Imagine those millions of houses being energy efficient, providing thermal comfort, the energy savings that they can provide. We believe it can be a decent case.
That's great. It's not like me to raise the first rule of thermodynamics once, let alone twice in a panel, but the energy efficiency, right? If you produce less energy, you use less energy to produce energy, and so on and so on and so on. And all energy production costs in land use, in water, in waste, even renewables. So critically important. And Dana, presumably the work you do with the country platforms looks at not just planning the project cycle of don't bring everything on stream at once because it can't all connect at once, but also is your grid, is your distribution transmission ready? But also potentially, and I know EBRD did some of this in Africa a while back, the smart cities, the getting the buses plugged in, but the sharing the energy. If you have an electric car, plug it into the grid at night, and the people can use that in the heat pump and things.
We do a lot on energy efficiency, and we bind it into country platforms at the national level as part of decarbonisation. We bind it into Green City Action Plans, which is a flagship program that's almost 10 years, and we invest in it. You know, like we put our money where our mouth is. And it usually makes returns. But again, it's this catalytic approach, you know, which is so important, which is prove that that's viable. On your data ask, we're working with a company, you'll be glad to know, which can, for £1 a house, identify heat and cooling needs from satellite. Early days, but you know, like we are looking all the time, but we don't do this on our own. We work with other MDBs because you cannot shift institutional regulations and standards, and you can't shift banks either. Data is and evidence is needed to overcome risk. So that is why banks take money very seriously, and we need data to assure our investors and meet our risk requirements. So we hear you. It's painful inside the bank. The bankers don't love it either. It's painful to ask and fill out the lists on both sides. However, I do think we are working very hard inside on using simplified templates. And I know there's a lot of work, you know, we hear it at the COP. We've been talking about it for a long time because it's not trivial. You know, we started off with rubbish in is rubbish out, and we've seen that. So, we're moving carefully forward because it's not an easy thing, but yes, we do need to make it simpler, and yes, we need to align and support interoperability, and we are working on it.
That's great. You remind me of a law enforcement story in the UK where they caught somebody growing marijuana on the roof because of the heat, and they saw the light heat from the satellite. So yeah, no secrets. No, it wasn't me. Agnes, we are almost to time, and I'd like to give you the last word, if I may. And I'd like to give you the last word to tell us whether or not, and if so, how, private sector investors from the US are getting involved in these country platforms, in the type of work Kenyatta does, in how, because, you know, politics is politics, but money just keeps moving, commerce just keeps happening. So do you have any concrete examples of how your members are involved in these countries in these types of projects?
So I'll be very honest and say I don't have concrete investor examples. In our membership, we are fully multi-sectoral. We represent roughly 300 US-based companies, primarily large multinational corporations. What I can say is that, despite current geopolitical challenges globally, US companies truly do remain committed to investments in climate action, in Paris-aligned investments. That's what we're seeing across our membership. And certainly, again, we represent multinational corporations. They operate trans-jurisdictionally. I think a good example is many of our members that are here at COP30, they have huge operations here in Brazil, for example. And I think a good example is a large chemical company who is on our delegation here. They have huge operations in Brazil, very focused on nature-based solutions. That is something that they are going forward with regardless, and dedicating a lot of money towards. So I think, yeah, the work continues. Again, regardless of political landscapes, it is tough. So yeah, I'm certain that we do have many members that are engaged across the African continent as well. But again, I don't have the details of what that's looking like. What I can share from our perspective as well, and you know this well, Wendy, through the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, because we are the US chapter of the International Chamber of Commerce, We have had a lot of our member companies be very engaged in the work of the ICC on macroprudential regulations and the simplifying of Basel III Convention, for example, and looking at those regulatory barriers to drive climate investment and climate finance. And I think there's a lot of work left to do on the simplification. And again, removing those regulatory barriers to create that incentivizing environment, because that's what it all comes back to. Giving business a reason, giving business a business case where it makes sense to place their capital towards the right directions and in support of Paris Agreement goals.
Really important, thanks Agnes. And even below the national committees, the individual chambers of commerce. You know, there's very few cities or even towns that don't have a chamber of commerce. And again, aggregation, it's everything. My gosh, I could talk to you all for the rest of the afternoon, and I've even forgotten the heat. This was so much fun. And thank you all so much. I know you've got to run, but that was so valuable, and I do hope it gets the distribution, because I think that was really important. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy.
I can't even stand up. Oh my God, thank you. Was that okay to do? Because when I went off piece, and then I thought, oh my gosh.
Right. You're going to listen to all the members who wants to put their agenda on the table. Wow. Thank you again.
Tell me about your grandfather. He was